Dorset, September 1816. The dinner had been arranged by Lady Thursby, which meant it had been arranged with the particular intensity of a woman who believed all situations could be improved by seating charts and candlelight, and who had spent 4 decades proving herself correct. Lady Thursby was the Duke of Calder's godmother, a role she interpreted with the breadth and authority of a constitutional office. And when she arranged a dinner at Calder Hall, it was understood that attendance was not optional, that the wine would be exceptional, and that some secondary purpose was operating beneath the social surface that would reveal itself at her chosen moment, and not before. The guest list was 14. The county families were present in their usual configuration: the Alderfords and the Pembrokes, and Sir Neville Creighton, who could be relied upon to discuss barley prices with anyone who would listen, and several who would not. But the addition that had set the county's attention into its sharpest focus was the Haldane family, who had arrived in Dorset 6 weeks earlier with the quiet force of people who had money enough to be patient and ambition enough not to be. Matthias Haldane had built a shipping concern out of Liverpool that now moved goods along half the southern coast, and he had recently acquired the harbor lease at Bridmouth, which was the kind of purchase that announced itself without requiring explanation. He was a man of 53, with the settled confidence of someone who had earned every room he entered and had stopped noticing the threshold years ago. He had 1 daughter. He had no sons. He had decided, around the time Cressida turned 14, that this was a fact to be used rather than regretted, and had proceeded accordingly. Cressida Haldane arrived at Calder Hall on her father's arm, wearing ivory silk, well cut, the kind of dress that understood wealth without performing it. She carried herself with the stillness of someone who knew that in unfamiliar rooms, the person who moved least often controlled the most. She had been told by her father that this dinner was social. She had been told by Lord Galt, who had been corresponding with her father for 3 months, and with her for none, that this dinner was an opportunity for her to be seen in the company she would soon be keeping. She had been told by no one what she actually needed to know, which was whether the man her father had chosen for her was the man she would have chosen for herself, a question that had not been asked because Matthias Haldane did not consider it a question. He considered it settled. Lord Galt was already in the drawing room. Piers Galt, Baron of Whitholm, 38, possessing a title that predated the Reformation and an estate that had been declining since roughly the same period. He greeted Cressida with the warm, proprietary attention of a man who had already counted her father's money in his head and was now assessing the vessel in which it would be delivered. She saw this. She had been seeing it for 3 months, in his letters to her father, in the way her father discussed the match as though it were a supply contract with favorable terms. She saw it and held it at the distance she kept all information she had not yet decided what to do with. The Duke of Calder appeared late. Not theatrically late, but late in the way of a man who lived in the house and did not consider his own drawing room a stage requiring a punctual entrance. Corwin Blackwell was 31, tall in the angular way of men who use their bodies for riding and walking rather than for posture, and he had the kind of face that looked as though it had been designed for seriousness and then surprised by intelligence. He entered the drawing room and assessed it with the efficiency of a man who had been hosting these evenings since his father died when he was 22. He saw Sir Neville cornering Matthias Haldane about coastal grain transport. He saw Lord Galt standing with Cressida in the window alcove with the posture of a man displaying an acquisition. And he saw the woman herself, standing with her hands clasped in front of her, perfectly still, her eyes moving across the room with attention that was not social. It was operational. She was reading the room the way he read rooms, and something about it unsettled him in a way he did not immediately identify. He watched Cressida manage Sir Neville's conversation about barley with the patience of someone who had managed worse, and then manage Lord Galt's attentions with a different patience, the kind that resembled warmth if you were not paying close attention, and resembled endurance if you were. He was paying close attention. After dinner, the Duke found himself near the window, where Matthias Haldane was standing, with the satisfied expression of a man whose evening was going according to plan. Galt was across the room with Cressida, speaking to her with the lowered voice and inclined posture of a man performing intimacy for an audience. "Your daughter," the Duke said to Matthias, "appears to have accepted her situation with considerable grace." "My daughter has excellent judgment," Matthias said. "She understands what this family requires." The Duke turned back to Matthias. "A fortunate arrangement," he said, "for both parties." He did not know that she had heard him. The drawing room carried voices in ways that Lady Thursby's seating charts could not control, and Cressida Haldane had spent a lifetime listening to men discuss her future in rooms where they believed she was occupied elsewhere. She had heard every word. She heard fortunate arrangement. She heard accepted her situation. She heard a man she had never met assess her in 14 words and conclude that she was a woman who had agreed to be sold and was pleased about the price. She did not respond immediately. She had learned in Liverpool drawing rooms and London parlors and the back offices of her father's shipping concern that the most effective responses were the ones delivered after the speaker believed the conversation was over. She waited until the evening's final circulation, when the guests moved through the entrance hall in the slow departure ritual of people who had been well fed and were reluctant to face the September night. Lord Galt was helping Lady Alderford with her wrap. Her father was deep in a final exchange with Sir Neville about harbor fees. The Duke was standing near the door, seeing his guests, out with the practiced efficiency of a host, concluding business. She approached him. He turned to her expecting a pleasantry, the standard departing courtesy, the forgettable social sentence that would end the evening without incident. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was level, unhurried, calibrated to carry exactly as far as the two of them, and no further. "You used the word fortunate this evening, regarding my situation. I want you to know that I heard it." He looked at her. Something shifted behind the precision in his face. "I also want you to know," she said, "that a woman standing in a room she did not choose, beside a man she did not select, wearing an expression she has practiced since she was 16, is not a woman who has accepted anything. She is a woman who has not yet decided what to do." She held his gaze for exactly long enough to make certain he understood that she meant every word, and not 1 second longer. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said. She turned and walked toward her father without looking back. Her hands were still clasped in front of her, exactly as they had been all evening, and her spine was exactly as straight, and nothing about her outward composure indicated that she had just said the most honest thing she had said to anyone in 3 months. In the carriage, her father was quiet for the first mile, which was his way of indicating that he had noticed something and was choosing his moment. "The Duke seemed attentive this evening," her father said. "The Duke," Cressida said, watching the dark through the window, "seemed like a man who has opinions about situations he does not understand, and delivers them as though they were observations." "Lord Galt was pleased with the evening," he offered. "Lord Galt is always pleased. It is his most consistent quality, and his least interesting one." Her father studied her in the lamplight with the steady attention of a man who had been watching this particular person for 23 years, and had developed a precise understanding of what her voice sounded like when she was managing something she had not yet named. He said nothing further. She turned back to the road ahead and thought about a man in a doorway who had called her situation fortunate, and about the expression on his face when she had told him it was not, and about what it meant that the correction had cost her something, though she was not yet prepared to identify what. The arrangement with Lord Galt continued through October, in the way that arrangements continued when one party was eager, one party was determined, and the third party had clasped hands, and an unspoken objection she had not yet found the correct venue for. Letters arrived from Whitholm every week. Her father reviewed them with the focused satisfaction of a man tracking a profitable investment. Cressida read them with the composed attention she brought to all documents that concerned her future, and found in them exactly what she expected, which was plans for her life written entirely in someone else's handwriting. In the second week of October, she made her decision. "I want to stay in Dorset," she said to her father over breakfast at the house he had leased in Bridmouth, the harbour town where his shipping operations were managed by a man named Calloway, who was competent and honest, and who had mentioned, on 3 occasions, that the operation would benefit from closer oversight. Her father set down his coffee. "Stay. The Bridmouth operations need direct management. Calloway is capable, but the harbour expansion requires decisions he is not authorized to make, and the correspondence between here and Liverpool is adding 3 weeks to every contract." She paused. "I can manage it." "You want to remain in Dorset," he said, "to manage a harbour." "I want to remain in Dorset because I am more useful here than in Liverpool, and because the Bridmouth operation is at a stage where remote management is costing us money." "And Lord Galt's estate is 12 miles from Bridmouth," her father said, "which I am certain is incidental. Lord Galt's proximity is a geographic fact, not a motivation." Her father studied her for a long moment. He was a man who had built a shipping empire by understanding when people were telling him the whole truth and when they were telling him the useful part of it, and he recognized the useful part when his daughter delivered it. "Calloway will report to you directly," he said. "The harbour contracts are yours to negotiate. The lease on this house is paid through March." "I will need an office at the warehouse," she said. "You will need to write to Lord Galt," her father said, "and explain your presence here in terms that are encouraging rather than ambiguous." "I will write to Lord Galt when I have something to say to him." Her father left for Liverpool on the 14th of October. Cressida moved her papers into the warehouse office on the 15th, and by the 16th, she was reviewing the harbour accounts with Calloway with the focused energy of a woman who had found, for the first time in 6 months, a room that belonged to her. She did not think about the Duke of Calder. She thought about tonnage reports and berthing fees and a warehouse roof that needed repair before the November storms. She thought about none of these things as a way of not thinking about the Duke of Calder, and she was moderately successful at maintaining the distinction. What she did not know, because she had no reason to know it, was that the Duke of Calder's estate shipped its entire autumn grain harvest through the Bridmouth harbour, and that the shipping agent who managed the Calder account was Calloway, and that the contract she was about to renegotiate on her father's behalf included terms that directly affected the most profitable estate in Dorset. She would discover this on a Wednesday morning in the last week of October, when she opened the account ledger and saw the name Blackwell on the 3rd page, and sat very still for a moment, and thought about a man in an entrance hall whose face had shifted when she told him what she was, and then continued reading with the composed attention of a woman who was not going to let a name on a page alter a business decision. She was going to manage the Bridmouth harbour. She was going to prove that she was more than a clause in her father's contract with Lord Galt. And if the Duke of Calder's grain happened to pass through her warehouse, that was a commercial fact, not a provocation. She almost believed this entirely. The warehouse office at Bridmouth Harbour was not designed for a woman of Cressida Haldane's position, a fact that the harbour master, a man named Ogden, who had been managing the docks for 20 years, mentioned on her first morning with the careful phrasing of a man who wanted it, noted that he had raised the concern. "The office is functional," Cressida said, setting her ledger on the desk that Calloway had cleared for her. "I am not here for the furnishings." The office was a square room on the upper floor of the main warehouse, with windows that faced the harbor on one side and the town on the other, and a desk that bore the rings of 20 years of coffee cups. It smelled of salt and timber and the faintly mineral tang of goods in transit. She found it, against her expectations, the most honest room she had occupied in months. She spent the first week learning, not the accounts, which she had already absorbed from the ledgers, but the operation itself, the rhythms and relationships and unwritten agreements that no ledger captured. She walked the docks every morning, watching the pilots bring the coastal traders through the Bridmouth Channel. She learned which captains were reliable and which ones shaved weight on their manifests. She learned that Ogden was competent and territorial and deeply skeptical of her, and that Calloway was competent and relieved and deeply grateful. She recorded everything. She sat in the office in the October evenings after the dock crews had gone home, and she wrote down every handshake agreement, every unwritten term, every customary practice that existed only in the memories of men who assumed the practices would outlast them. By the end of the second week, she had a more complete account of the Bridmouth Harbor's actual operations than anyone had assembled in its history. Calloway noticed first. "Miss Haldane," he said on a Friday afternoon, "you have done in 2 weeks what I have been meaning to do for 3 years. You were managing alone," she said without looking up. "That is no longer the case." The county noticed second. Bridmouth was a small harbor town, and a young woman of evident wealth sitting in a warehouse office and walking the docks at 7 in the morning was not a thing that passed unremarked. Sir Neville Creighton, who shipped barley through Bridmouth and had been one of the first to notice anything that affected his grain, mentioned her to the Duke at a chance meeting on the Calder Estate Road in the 3rd week of October. "The Haldane girl is managing the harbor herself," Sir Neville said, with the tone of a man reporting something he found both irregular and interesting. "Walks the docks, knows the manifests. Ogden says she renegotiated the Weymouth contract in a single afternoon and improved the terms by 12%. Miss Haldane is managing her father's operations," the Duke said. "It is a commercial matter." "It is a commercial matter conducted by a woman who is engaged to Lord Galt," Sir Neville said, "in a harbor through which your grain ships every autumn. I should think it was several matters at once." The Duke dismissed Sir Neville with a look that people who did not know him mistook for patience, and people who did know him recognized as the instant before a conversation was concluded. He did not ride to Bridmouth. He did not make inquiries about the harbor operations or the woman who had stood in his entrance hall in September and told him that she had not yet decided what to do. He did not think about any of these things with any particular frequency, and the fact that he asked his steward 2 days later for a detailed summary of the Calder shipping arrangements through Bridmouth was entirely unrelated. The steward, a man named Hatch, who had served the Calder estate for 15 years and understood his employer completely and without comment, provided the summary by Thursday. The Duke read it in his study and noted that the autumn grain shipment was due for renewal in November. He set the summary aside and told himself that the shipping contract was a practical concern, and that practical concerns were the only kind he had time for. The contract arrived on Cressida's desk on the 1st of November, delivered by Calloway, with the studied neutrality of a man who understood its significance and had decided to let her discover it for herself. She read it. It was a standard freight agreement, with terms that had been favorable to the Calder estate 4 years ago, and were now, given the harbor improvements her father had funded, moderately unfavorable to the Haldane operation. Not exploitatively so, just enough to indicate that the previous terms had been negotiated by someone who had been more interested in maintaining the relationship than in maximizing the rate. She wrote to Mr. Hatch, proposing a meeting at the office on Thursday at 10. She signed it with her full name. No courtesy flourishes, no social padding. The kind of letter her father would have written. Mr. Hatch arrived on Thursday. He was a man of 50, precise and unhurried, with the manner of someone who had been conducting business on behalf of a duke for long enough that he carried a fraction of the authority without any of the title. The negotiation took 2 hours. She proposed a rate increase of 15%. He countered with 8. She presented her analysis of comparable rates at Portland and Weymouth, compiled over 2 weeks with the thoroughness of someone who believed that preparation was the only form of leverage that could not be taken away. They settled at 11%, which was fair, and which both understood reflected her preparation more than his position. Mr. Hatch departed with the new terms and the expression of a man who was going to have an interesting conversation with his employer. On Friday morning, a letter arrived in a hand she recognized, not Hatch's measured clerk's script, the Duke's own writing. Miss Haldane, Hatch informs me that the shipping terms have been renegotiated with a proficiency he described, in his particular way, as not what he had expected. I have learned over 15 years that when Hatch says this, it means he was outmaneuvered and is attempting to frame it as a compliment. The new terms are acceptable. There is, however, a related matter regarding the November shipment schedule that requires discussion directly. I will call at the warehouse office on Monday at 11, if that is convenient. Calder. She noted the dryness, which wasn't charm but was something adjacent to it. She noted that he had written himself rather than sending Hatch. She noted the word directly, and thought about the last time she had spoken to him directly, in his entrance hall, when she had told him that she had not accepted anything. She wrote back, "Monday at 11 is convenient. C. Haldane." She sent it and returned to the customs paperwork, and did not think about the fact that she had spent 4 minutes composing a 9-word reply. He arrived on Monday at 3 minutes past 11, which she noted because she noted everything, and because the 3 minutes told her something, though she was not certain what. He entered the office and took in the salt-stained desk, the harbor charts on the wall, the woman sitting behind the desk with her pen still in her hand, because she had not put it down when he entered, because she was not going to arrange herself for his arrival. They discussed the shipment schedule for 40 minutes. He knew his estate's output figures from memory. She knew the harbor's capacity constraints from documentation she had assembled. They disagreed twice, once about loading priority, which she conceded because he was right, and once about demurrage terms, which he conceded because she was right. And both concessions were made with the economy of people who respected the other's reasoning enough to yield without performance. At the end of the 40 minutes, the schedule was agreed, and neither of them moved to end the meeting. "I owe you a correction," he said. She waited. "In September, I said your situation appeared fortunate. I was speaking about something I didn't understand, and I was using your composure as evidence for a conclusion I had already reached before I entered the room." She held his gaze. "Yes, you were." He received the confirmation with the stillness of a man who had expected it and believed he deserved it. "I will not make the same error twice," he said. "I have not yet determined whether that is a promise or an aspiration." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, the ghost of one quickly managed. "I suppose," he said, "that will depend on the evidence." "It always does," she said. He stood. "Good morning, Miss Haldane." "Good morning, Your Grace." He left the office. She sat at the desk and watched the harbor through the window and thought about the correction he had offered without qualification, and about the fact that the ghost of a smile had done something to the geometry of his face that she was going to have to account for at some point, though not today. Today she had shipping contracts to manage. November tightened around the Dorset coast, the winds sharpening, the harbor traffic thickening with the last autumn shipments, and Cressida's days filled with the intensity of a woman managing a commercial operation through its most demanding season. Lord Galt visited on a Thursday. He arrived at the office unannounced, which was his habit, and which Cressida had learned to interpret not as spontaneity, but as territorial assertion, the assumption that she would always be available because availability was, in his understanding, part of the arrangement. Cressida, Galt said, using her first name with the ease of a man who considered the familiarity already earned. He surveyed the office with amused assessment. Your father mentioned you were working from here. I confess I did not expect quite so literal an interpretation. She held steady. The harbor operations require direct management, but I wonder whether the season might be better spent at Whitholm. Your father and I have discussed a spring date. April, ideally. The county expects it. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the word expects, which implied her agreement was a fixed point around which the schedule was being built. I have not agreed to an April date, she said. Your father has indicated. My father has indicated his preference. A preference is not a commitment. Galt departed 20 minutes later, with the composed smile of a man who had not gotten what he came for and was not accustomed to the experience. Calloway, who had been working in the outer office with the studied concentration of a man pretending not to listen, said nothing when Cressida returned to the schedules. She said nothing either. She considered the December ledger and thought about April, and about the word expects, and about the narrowing corridor her father and Lord Galt were building around her, with the efficient cooperation of men who agreed on the destination and considered the passengers' feelings a secondary concern. The storm arrived on the 28th of November. It came from the southwest, hard enough to close the harbor for 2 days. Cressida was at the warehouse at 6 in the morning when the winds peaked, and still there at midnight when the damage assessment began. 2 of the Calder grain vessels had been caught at the outer moorings. One had held. The other had dragged anchor and struck the harbor wall, damaging the hull below the waterline. The grain was intact, but immovable until the vessel was repaired, and the vessel could not be repaired at Bridmouth. She wrote to the Duke at 7 the following morning, before she had slept, because the cargo was his, and the harbor was hers, and the situation required communication, not rest. The letter was factual, specific, and included 3 options for managing the stranded cargo, ranked by cost and time, with her recommendation clearly stated. His reply arrived before noon. 5 lines. It accepted her recommendation without modification, authorized the costs, and ended with a sentence she read 3 times. Your management of the situation is noted and appreciated. I will call at Bridmouth tomorrow to inspect the damage. The matter of the repair costs should be discussed between us directly, not through intermediaries. Calder. He arrived the following morning at 9. She met him at the harbor wall, not the office, because the damage was the point, and she was not going to conduct this conversation from behind a desk when the evidence was standing in the water in front of them. They walked the damaged section together. She showed him the hull breach, the cargo staging she had improvised overnight. He listened with complete attention, thoroughly and without interruption. The repair costs, he said. The harbor wall is the Haldane lease. The vessel is mine. The storm is neither of ours. How do you propose we divide it? She had 3 calculations ready, apportioned by responsibility, by benefit, by precedent. She had been awake for 26 hours, and her preparation was still immaculate. The wall repair is mine. The vessel repair is yours. The cargo restaging costs, which benefited both parties, I propose we split equally. He studied her for a moment. He took in the woman standing beside him in a coat that was practical rather than fashionable, with harbor salt on her gloves, and exhaustion she was not concealing because she had stopped performing for anyone, and something in his expression completed the shift she had been tracking since the office. The recalculation was finished. What replaced it was recognition. The proposal is fair, he said. I accept it without modification. He paused. Miss Haldane, I have managed the Calder estate for 9 years. In that time, I have dealt with 11 storms and more shipping contracts than I care to count. I have never once received a damage report at 7 in the morning that included 3 ranked options and a clear recommendation, written by someone who had been awake all night managing the crisis herself. She was too tired for composure and too precise for false modesty. I manage what is in front of me. The storm was in front of me. Yes, he said. He held her gaze. I am beginning to understand that about you. They stood at the harbor wall in the November morning, and she thought about the word beginning, and about the fact that it was the word of a man who had realized his assessment was going to take considerably longer than he had planned. The restaging crew will need access to the Calder wagons this afternoon, she said, because practical matters were the language she trusted. You have them, he said. I will speak to Hatch this morning. He mounted his horse and rode back toward Calder Hall, and she stood at the harbor wall and watched him go, and thought about what it would mean if she allowed that recognition to matter. She was too tired to decide. She went back to the office and slept for 2 hours in the chair behind the desk, and when she woke, the harbor was functioning again, and the question of what the Duke of Calder's recognition meant could wait until she had managed everything that could not. December brought the Dorset social season into its tightest orbit. The county dinners began, the same families rotating through the same rooms with practiced ease. Cressida had been absorbed into the circuit with the cautious curiosity of a county that had not yet made up its mind about her, but was paying close attention while it deliberated. She and the Duke were at the same dinner 3 times in December. The first was at the Alderford house, where they were placed at opposite ends of the table by a hostess who had heard the harbor stories and was managing the situation with the conservative instinct of a woman who did not wish to be responsible for whatever was developing. They exchanged one remark about the storm repairs, which was overheard by Sir Neville, and became, through the efficient machinery of county conversation, the most discussed sentence of the following week. The second was at Pembroke Hall, a smaller gathering of 10, where the seating was intimate enough that avoidance was impossible, and proximity was a fact of geometry rather than design. They talked about the harbor for 5 minutes, then the county road repairs for 10, then a book on coastal engineering she had ordered from London that he had already read, and the conversation moved with the ease of 2 minds that processed information at the same speed and found the same things interesting, which was, she understood, a considerably more dangerous compatibility than the physical kind. The third dinner was at Calder Hall. Lady Thursby had arranged the evening with transparent determination, seating Cressida at the Duke's left, which was not the position of highest honor, but was the position of closest conversation. Lord Galt was placed 5 seats away, near enough to observe and too far to intervene, a piece of geometry Lady Thursby had executed, with the serene ruthlessness of a woman who had been managing rooms for longer than Galt had been alive. Cressida was aware of Galt watching. She was aware of the Duke beside her, talking about the harbor expansion with focused attention that she had come to understand was not merely professional, but was the way he expressed interest in things he found genuinely compelling. She was aware that these 2 awarenesses were increasingly difficult to hold simultaneously, and that the space between them was becoming the space in which she was going to have to make a decision. After dinner, Lady Thursby appeared at her side in the drawing room. He watches you, you know, Lady Thursby said, glancing across the room at her godson. Not the way Galt watches you. Galt watches you as though you were an item on an inventory. Corwin watches you as though you were a problem he has not yet solved and is not certain he wants to. Cressida studied her gloves. I am not a problem. No, you are considerably more inconvenient than a problem. Problems have solutions. You have opinions. She paused. And Lord Galt has expectations. Those 2 things are going to collide, my dear. The question is not whether, but when. And who is standing where? when it happens. Lady Thursby, my arrangement with Lord Galt is a family matter. Your arrangement with Lord Galt, Lady Thursby said with quiet gentleness, is a cage that your father built and Galt furnished, and you have been sitting in it, with your hands clasped and your composure intact, and everyone in this county can see it except the two men who hold the key. She met Cressida's eyes, and my godson, who sees everything and acts on nothing until he is certain, is watching that cage with an expression I have not seen on his face in a very long time. She touched Cressida's arm briefly. Certainty sometimes requires a catalyst. She moved away. Cressida stood in the drawing room and turned toward the Duke, who was not meeting her gaze, who was managing his guests with customary precision, and who was, she understood with sudden clarity, not meeting her gaze with the deliberate effort of a man who was choosing not to look and finding the choice increasingly expensive. She turned toward Lord Galt, who was watching her from 5 seats worth of distance, with proprietary attention that had once seemed merely confident and now seemed like something she needed to name more honestly. She thought about the word cage. She thought about the word catalyst. She thought about what it would take to make the drawing room and the warehouse office feel like the same life. The winter assembly at Pembroke Hall was the largest gathering of the Dorset season. 50 guests, the full county, the chandelier-lit rooms that the Pembrokes opened once a year with the particular generosity of a family that understood tradition, properly maintained, was a form of currency. Cressida arrived with Lady Thursby. She wore dark blue velvet, well cut, and her mother's pearl brooch at her collar, which was the only piece of her mother she carried, and which she wore when she needed to feel anchored. The Duke was already present. He was across the room in conversation with 2 men from the harbor board, and he glanced up when she entered with the attention she had stopped pretending not to track. Their eyes met for 1 beat, 2, and then they returned to their respective conversations, and the evening began its slow social rotation. Lord Galt arrived late. He entered with the energy of a man whose composure had loosened since the afternoon. Not dramatically, but enough to sand the edges off his usual calibrated charm. And he found Cressida, within minutes, with the directional certainty of a man tracking something he considered his. "Cressida," he said, arriving at her side where she stood with Lady Alderford discussing the spring planting. "You look well." "Thank you," she said. The evening moved. She circulated. She conversed. She managed the room with the composure she had been practicing for years. Galt circled at her periphery, appearing and reappearing with the persistence of a man who wanted the county to see him beside her and was not concerned about whether she wanted the same. She found herself near the Duke in the 2nd hour. She had not engineered it. They stood near the tall windows overlooking the Pembroke Gardens, white with frost, and talked about the harbor pilot rotation, and then a coastal survey he had commissioned for the Calder headland. And the conversation had the ease of 2 people who had developed, over 3 months, a shared language that required no social translation. She was aware that Galt, across the room, was watching with an expression that had moved past proprietary and into something sharper. Galt arrived at her left. He arrived with the momentum of a man who had been building to something all evening and had chosen his moment with the instinct of someone who wanted witnesses. "Cressida," he said, and his hand closed around her elbow, not gently, not painfully, with the grip of a man asserting a physical claim and expecting it to be accepted. "I believe we are wanted for the next dance." She studied his hand on her arm with the precise attention she brought to documents and contracts, and the evaluation was immediate and complete. "I was in conversation with His Grace," she said, her voice level. "And now you are wanted elsewhere," Galt said. His smile was still in place, the practiced one, but his grip had not changed, and the room around them had registered it. and the quality of the surrounding silence was shifting. She turned to the Duke. He was watching Galt's hand on her arm with an expression she had never seen. Not assessment, not recalculation. Something underneath all of them, something that had been building in a place he had not shown her. And it was very still and very focused, and it made the air in the room change temperature. "Lord Galt," the Duke said. His voice was quiet, and the quietness was not softness. It was control, the kind of control that preceded something that would not be controlled for much longer. "Your Grace," Galt said, still holding her arm, "I am merely collecting my intended for—" "Remove your hand," the Duke said. The room heard it. The nearest guests heard it with the sudden, focused attention of people who understood that something was happening that would be discussed for the rest of the season. Galt's smile flickered. "I beg your pardon?" The Duke stepped forward. One step. He placed himself between Cressida and Lord Galt with deliberate precision. Galt's hand, by the geometry of the movement, was displaced from her arm. "She is not yours," the Duke said. The words were not loud. They carried the weight of a man who had 200 years of Dorset in his voice and did not need volume to fill a room. They carried every dinner and every contract, and every morning at the harbor wall, and every conversation that had shown him, piece by piece, who this woman was and what was being done to her. Galt stared at him, the charm gone, replaced by the raw displeasure of a man publicly challenged on a claim he considered settled. "The arrangement is between myself and her father. It is not a matter for the arrangement," the Duke said, and his voice had not risen, but the room had somehow gotten quieter around it. "Is a contract written about a person who was not consulted, by men who did not ask, enforced by a hand on her arm that she did not invite." He held Galt with complete, undivided attention. "She is not a clause. She is not a term. She is not an asset to be collected from a conversation when it suits you, and she is not yours." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room full of people holding their breath simultaneously. Galt surveyed the room, which was watching him with the politely devastating attention of 50 people who had just witnessed something they would never forget. "This is not finished," Galt said quietly, and turned and walked toward the door with the rigid posture of a man preserving the last of his dignity for the journey to the exit. The room exhaled. Conversations resumed, carefully, with the studied normalcy of people pretending they had not just witnessed what they had witnessed. Lady Thursby, across the room, caught Cressida's eye with the expression of a woman who had predicted this moment for 3 months and was experiencing the satisfaction of confirmed judgment without the slightest intention of concealing it. The Duke turned to Cressida. He regarded her with an expression that had nothing managed in it, nothing assessed, nothing recalculated. Just the raw, unguarded attention of a man who had done something he could not take back and was not interested in taking it back. "Miss Haldane," he said. His voice was his own again, the quiet one that was not performing for the room but speaking to her. She thought about the hand on her arm and the words that had displaced it, and the man who had stepped between her and a cage, and had not claimed her for himself, but had simply said, with the authority of everything he was, that the cage was not acceptable. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were clasped. Her composure was intact. But something behind her composure had shifted. She knew he could see it, and she knew he would not say anything about it tonight, and she knew that the not saying was its own kind of declaration. "I believe I would like some air," she said. "I can find my own way to a garden," she added before he could speak. "I know," he said. "I wasn't offering to guide you. I was asking whether you wanted company." She held his gaze one moment longer than the social register required. Yes, she said. I believe I do. The Pembroke garden in December was a study in cold clarity, the paths white with frost, the hedgerows skeletal against the night sky, and the kind of cold that made every breath visible and every word feel more deliberate for having been spoken into air that wanted silence. They walked the main path without speaking for the first minute. The assembly noise faded behind them, and the garden was theirs, and the silence between them was not awkward, but full. She spoke first. You should not have done that. He turned to her. Yes, I should have. You have made an enemy of Lord Galt. Lord Galt wasn't a friend worth preserving. You have made a public declaration that the county will interpret in exactly one way. The county will interpret it correctly. She stopped walking. They were beneath a bare lime tree, the frost on its branches catching light from the assembly windows. Why? She said. He was quiet for a moment. He considered the frost on the path, the garden wall, the things men considered when deciding whether to say the true thing or the safe thing. My sister, he said. She waited. Arabella. She was married at 19 to a man my father chose, a man of good family and considerable charm, the kind of charm that is a performance rather than a quality. She understood that he was telling her something he did not tell people, and that the telling was costing him, and that the cost was the reason it mattered. The marriage was efficient. My father was satisfied. The families were aligned. Arabella wrote letters that were cheerful and appropriate and increasingly brief, and I did not read them carefully enough because I was 20, and I believed that arrangements made by fathers were sound by definition, and that my sister's composure was evidence of contentment rather than evidence of something else entirely. He stopped. The December air moved between them. She did not speak. She understood that interrupting a man in the middle of this particular confession would be worse than silence, and that the silence itself was doing work that words could not. She came home after 2 years. She came home diminished, not visibly, but diminished in the way that a person is diminished when they have spent 2 years being managed by someone who believed that management was the same thing as love. Cressida stood in the frost and thought about a hand on her arm, and about a man who had removed it, and understood why he had removed it, with that particular expression and that particular force. She recovered, he said. Arabella is well. She lives in Bath. She paints. She is herself again, or a version close enough that most people cannot see the difference. He met Cressida's eyes. I can see the difference. I have been seeing it for 11 years. So when you saw Galt's hand on my arm, I saw my father's judgment, he said. I saw a man who had been told yes by a contract, and had never thought to wonder whether the person inside the contract had a different answer. I saw an arrangement that everyone agreed was fortunate, and I saw what fortunate looked like from the inside. She heard the word, fortunate, land between them, the same word he had used in September. In September, you used that word about me. I believed what the room showed me, a woman with composure, and a man with confidence, and a father with satisfaction. It looked like agreement. I did not look past the surface because I was not. He stopped. You were not invested in looking, she said. I was not yet paying the kind of attention that shows you what is underneath the composure. He held her gaze. I am paying it now. I have been trying to find a way out, she said. He waited. The arrangement. My father believes it is settled. I've been trying, since September, to find a way to unseat it that does not require me to become a different person, a person who makes scenes and issues ultimatums. I am not that person. She considered her clasped hands. I manage things. I endure things. I outlast things. And I have been failing, because Galt does not respond to endurance. He interprets it as agreement. He will not interpret tonight as agreement, the Duke said. No. He will go to my father, and my father will. She stopped. She had not meant to show him the full architecture of the trap, the way it was built from her father's ambition and Galt's entitlement and her own composure, which had become the material they built with. The very quality that should have protected her turned into the thing that made the cage invisible. Your father will hear from me before he hears from Galt, the Duke said. I do not need you to speak to my father on my behalf. No, you do not. But I am going to, because what I said in that room tonight wasn't a social opinion. It was a position, and I maintain my positions. What position, exactly? That you are a person who has the right to decide her own life, that your composure is not consent, that your father's contract is not your contract. He paused. And that any man who puts his hand on your arm without your permission, in my presence, will be corrected, regardless of the consequences. She stood in the frost and thought about a man who had watched his sister be diminished by an arrangement everyone called fortunate, and had carried that watching for 11 years, and had seen the same pattern beginning again in a room full of candlelight, and had said no with everything he had. Thank you, she said. It is not generosity, he said. It is accuracy. She almost smiled. It was the first almost smile of the evening, small and real and unmanaged. And he received it with an expression that told her he understood exactly what it had cost and what it meant. They walked back toward the assembly together, the distance between them close enough to mean something, and far enough to preserve the thing that had not yet been said, the thing that was going to require a different conversation and a readiness neither of them had quite reached, though both were closer than they had been an hour ago. The Duke called at the Bridmouth warehouse on a Tuesday morning, 4 days after the assembly, which was slow enough to suggest deliberation, and fast enough to mean the deliberation had been concluded. She was at her desk. She had been at her desk every morning since the assembly, because the desk was the place where she was most herself, and because the harbor did not care about assemblies, or dukes, or the memory of a grip on her arm that had faded, but remained in her thoughts considerably longer. He appeared in the doorway. He took in the room with the expression she now recognized, the one that read a space as information about the person inside it, and found what he was seeing confirmed something he valued. Miss Haldane, Your Grace, please sit. He sat. He did not begin with the harbor or the shipping schedule. He sat in the chair across from her desk and regarded her with an expression that had nothing of September in it, and everything of the months since. I have written to your father, he said. She set down her pen. You said you would. I told him that I witnessed Lord Galt's conduct at the assembly. I told him the arrangement was not in his daughter's interest. I told him I was speaking as someone who had spent 3 months observing his daughter's capabilities and character, and who believed she deserved the right to determine her own course. And what did my father say? He has not yet replied. She turned to the harbor through the window. She considered her father reading a letter from a duke about the daughter he had been organizing into a marriage for 9 months, and whether the weight of the title would accomplish what her own objections had not. You did not claim me, she said. He turned back to her. At the assembly, in the garden, in your letter. You did not say I was yours. You said I was not his. Yes, that is a very particular distinction. It is the only honest one. You are not mine to claim. You are yours. That has been evident to me since you stood in my entrance hall in September and told me that you had not yet decided what to do. She studied the man who had stepped between her and Galt, and had said she isn't yours, and had then, in a letter to her father, said the same thing in different language, and who was now sitting across her desk and saying, "You are yours," as though it were the simplest observation in the world, and as though he did not understand that it was the most important thing anyone had said to her in 23 years. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I stayed in Dorset because of you." He was still. The harbor operations were real. Calloway needed oversight. All of that is true. But I stayed because of what I said to you in your entrance hall, and because your face when I said it was the first evidence I had seen in 6 months that someone had heard me. Not my father's accounts, not my composure. Me? She considered the contracts and harbor charts spread across her desk. I told myself it was business. I told my father it was business. I was moderately convincing for about 3 weeks, and then your name appeared in the shipping ledger, and I understood that I had arranged my own proximity and called it commerce, and I was not as embarrassed about this as I should have been. Something happened at the corner of his mouth, the ghost of the smile, the one he managed quickly, and she catalogued carefully. "Miss Haldane," he said. "Cressida," she said. The name landed in the office like a change in the weather. "Cressida," he said, and her name in his voice was different from her name in anyone else's, specific and careful and precise. "I have been finding reasons to come to Bridmouth since October. The shipping contract required 1 meeting. I attended 3. The storm damage required a letter. I came in person. The November schedule required Hatch's attention. I gave it mine." He held her gaze. "I have been conducting an extended audit of the Bridmouth Harbor, and the audit has required approximately 4 times the attention any harbor operation has ever warranted from a Duke of Calder, and my steward has noticed, and my godmother has noticed, and I find that I do not care." She stood. He stood. They were very close in the harbor office, with light coming through the salt-hazed windows, and the contracts on the desk between them, and 3 months of careful distance, dissolving in the space between one breath and the next. "I have not yet decided what to do," she said. It was the sentence from September, the same words. But her voice was different now, and the meaning was different, and they both heard the difference. "Yes, you have," he said. She unclasped her hands. It was the first time she had unclasped them in his presence. The first time she had released the composure she had been holding since September. The self-contained stillness that had been her protection and her signature. She put her hand on his arm. Flat and deliberate. The way a woman touched something she had chosen. He covered her hand with his. He kissed her. It was not cautious. It had the honesty of a man who had spent 3 months revising every assumption he had walked into a dining room with, and who had arrived at a conclusion he was prepared to defend to her father and to Galt and to the entire county of Dorset. She kissed him back with the precision she brought to contracts and harbor schedules and every true decision she had ever made. And the office was warm with December sun through the windows, and the harbor was working outside, and her hands were open, and nothing required management. When they separated, she kept her hand on his arm and looked at him with the expression she wore when she was not performing for anyone, the one that had nothing of composure in it, and everything of the woman underneath. "My father," she said. "I will speak to him." "We will speak to him," she said. "Together. I am not a message to be delivered. I am a party to the negotiation." The corner of his mouth did the thing she had been cataloging. I would not have expected otherwise. "Good. Then we understand each other." "We are beginning to," he said. "You keep saying beginning." "Because every time I believe I have accounted for you completely," he said, "you add a variable I had not anticipated." "Get used to it," she said. Her father arrived in Dorset on a Friday, 3 days after the Duke's letter, and 2 days after Galt's letter, and one day after Cressida's letter, which meant he had received them in the order of authority, accusation, and truth, and had come in person because he understood that some negotiations could not be conducted by post. She met him at the Bridmouth house. He settled into the chair by the fire, marked by the expression of a man who had spent the journey reconsidering things he had believed were settled. "The Duke of Calder writes a very direct letter," her father said. "He is a very direct man. He says Galt's conduct was unacceptable. He says the arrangement is not in your interest. He does not say what his own interest is, which is either very principled or very strategic. It is both, and his interest is not the reason we are having this conversation. My interest is the reason." Her father regarded her with the attention she had known her entire life, the attention that had seen her capabilities early and valued them, and also, she understood now, directed them into channels of his choosing with the same efficiency he brought to shipping routes. "You do not want to marry Galt," he said. "I have never wanted to marry Galt. I have been telling you this in every way I know how, except the direct one, because the direct one required me to oppose you, and I was not willing to do that until I had something to stand on that was mine." She gestured at the room, at the harbor beyond it, at the 3 months of work she had built. "This is mine. This operation, this competence, this life. I did it to show you, and to show myself, that I am not a term in a contract. I am the person who writes the contract." The fire moved in the grate. Her father was quiet for a long time. "I did what I believed was best for you," he said. "You did what you believed was best for the family," she said, not unkindly. "Those are not always the same thing, and I am asking you to recognize the difference." The Duke arrived at 4 o'clock, which was the time Cressida had specified because she had wanted the conversation with her father to happen first, on her terms, before the Duke's presence changed the weight in the room. They sat together, the 3 of them, in the rented parlor in Bridmouth, and the conversation was conducted with the precision of people who understood that what was being negotiated was not a marriage, but a recognition. The recognition that Cressida Haldane was a person whose choices were her own. Her father considered the Duke with the assessment of a man who had spent 30 years evaluating people across negotiating tables, and who understood, with the instinct that had built his fortune, that the man across from him was not negotiating for a price, but standing beside a person. "You are not asking for my daughter," her father said. "No," the Duke said. "Your daughter has made her own decision. I am here because she asked me to be, and because the decision she has made includes me, and I consider that the most significant honor I have received." Her father turned to Cressida. She met him with the steady composure he had always valued, used for the first time entirely on her own behalf. "The arrangement with Galt is dissolved," her father said. "Thank you," Cressida said. "And the Duke?" "The Duke," she said, turning to Corwin, who regarded her with the expression she had catalogued and was now permitted to keep, "is not an arrangement. He is a choice." Her father stood. He crossed the room and took his daughter's hands, both of them, the hands that had been clasped in self-containment for months and were now open, and said, "You are more than I planned for. I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give." "I know," she said. "I learned it from you." Lady Thursby hosted the engagement dinner in the 2nd week of January. The county attended and approved, with the satisfied attention of people who had been watching a story unfold and were pleased with the ending. Lord Galt was not invited. Lady Thursby had considered it, but concluded that on this occasion, absence was the cleaner statement. They were married in March at the Stone Church in Bridmouth, which was not the grandest church in Dorset, but was the one that stood between the harbor and the Calder estate, between the world she had built and the world she was entering. And she had chosen it for that reason, and for the east window, which caught the March morning light in a way that made the old stone look new. She wore dark blue. The Duke had not been surprised. Lady Thursby had not been surprised. Her father had simply nodded when she told him, with the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by his daughter and had settled into the more sustainable practice of admiring her. The county turned out. Dorset turned out. The harbor workers were there, Ogden and Calloway, and the dock crews who had watched her walk the quay at 7 in the morning for 5 months, and who attended because they wanted to, which was, she thought, a different kind of validation than the county's, and in some ways a better one. She walked in on her father's arm and thought about the dining room in September, and the word fortunate, and the entrance hall, and the sentence she had delivered to a man she did not know, about a situation she had not yet decided what to do with. She had decided. She thought about all the versions of her hands, clasped in the drawing room at Calder Hall, holding everything in, showing nothing. Clasped at the harbor wall in November, too tired and too honest to perform. Still clasped at the assembly, when Galt's grip had closed on her arm, and the Duke had stepped forward and said the words that changed the shape of everything. And then unclasped, in the warehouse office, on a December Tuesday, when she had opened her hands and placed one on his arm and chosen him, not because he had rescued her, but because he had seen her, the version of her that managed harbors and wrote damage reports at dawn and argued shipping terms without apology, and had said "you are yours" before he ever considered saying "you are mine." She reached the front of the church. Corwin regarded her with an expression that had nothing of September in it, nothing of the man who had assessed a room and drawn a conclusion and called it observation. Just him, entirely present, looking at the woman who had stood in his entrance hall and told him the truth, and then spent 5 months proving it in ways he had not anticipated and could not have invented and did not deserve and had been given anyway. She took his hand, not clasped, not guarded, open. He held it with the grip of a man who meant what he committed to, and then he did not let go. After the ceremony, in the garden of Calder Hall, her father found her near the harbor path, looking at the Bridmouth rooftops visible in the distance. "You are keeping the harbor operation," he said. "Calloway reports to me. The contracts are mine. This wasn't negotiable. I did not imagine it was." He regarded her with the attention of 23 years, the attention that had never in all that time missed anything important. "Is he good enough for you?" She thought about a man who had said she is not yours to a baron in a room full of people, and had then said, "You are yours" in a warehouse office with no audience at all, and about which sentence had mattered more, and about the fact that he understood which sentence mattered more, and that this understanding was the thing that made him worthy of the answer. "He is trying to be," she said, "and he is the kind of man whose trying is better than most men's certainty." Her father kissed her forehead, which he had not done since she was 12, and went back to the breakfast. Corwin found her a few minutes later. He stood beside her on the path and considered the harbor in the distance, and the Calder grounds around them, and the March afternoon moving across the Dorset coastline in the long, clear way of early spring. "The warehouse office," he said. "What about it?" "I have been thinking about it, about the desk and the salt on the windows and the contracts and the view of the harbor." He paused. "That is where you are most yourself. That is the room where I understood who you were. Not the dining room, not the assembly, the warehouse at the desk, with your pen still in your hand, because you would not put it down when I walked in." She looked at the harbor in the distance, at the life she had built from a rented house and a shipping ledger, and the determination of a woman who had refused to be a clause in someone else's contract. Corwin, she said. Yes. I am not yours because you stood between me and Galt. I am not yours because you wrote to my father. I am not yours because you said she is not yours in a room full of people. He turned to her. I am yours because you said you are yours first, because you gave me back to myself before you ever asked for anything. That is why I chose you. That is the only reason that matters. He took her hand. She let him take it. Open, unclasped, given freely. The March afternoon went on around them, clear and unhurried, and the harbor worked in the distance, and the county went about its business, and neither of them said anything further for a long moment, because everything that needed saying had been said, and what remained was simply the living of it, which they intended to do thoroughly, and with considerable mutual inconvenience, for a very long time.